I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, today, we drink seltzer. Today, we enter the third day of the Trump shutdown, the first ever real shutdown to occur when one party controls the entire legislative process. The Republican Party controls the House, the Senate, the presidency, and yet they were unable to keep the government open for the American people. Leader McConnell knows it takes 60 votes to win passage of a spending bill, and yet he moved forward with a last-minute extension that he knew lacked the votes. Both Democrats and Republicans voted against that bill. The reason the Republican majority had such difficulty finding consensus is they could never get a firm grip on what the president of their party wanted to do. These days, you never know who to deal with when it comes to the Republicans. The Republican leaders told me to work out a deal with the White House. The White House said work it out with Republican leaders on the Hill. Separately, President Trump turned away from not one, but two bipartisan compromises. Each would have averted this shutdown. Each would have led to a deal on the budget and health care and disaster aid and things like opioids and veterans and pensions and on immigration. My recent offer to the president was a generous one. I put his signature campaign issue on the table in exchange for DACA, and still, he turned away. President Trump's unwillingness to compromise caused the Trump shutdown and brought us to this moment. The facts are well known. Now I wish to update the Senate on where things stand after this weekend. Since our meeting in the Oval Office on Friday, the President and I have not spoken, and the White House refused to engage in negotiations over the weekend. The great deal-making President sat on the sidelines. Despite and because of this frustration, I've been having conversations with the Republican leader over the weekend about a path forward. After several discussions, offers, counteroffers, the Republican leader and I have come to an arrangement. We will vote today to reopen the government, to continue negotiating a global agreement, with the commitment that, if an agreement isn't reached by February the 8th, the Senate will immediately proceed to consideration of legislation dealing with DACA. The process will be neutral and fair to all sides. We expect that a bipartisan bill on DACA will receive fair consideration and an up or down vote on the floor. Now, it's a shame, Mr. President, that the American people and the Senate have had to endure such hand-wringing, finger-pointing stridency to secure a guarantee that we will finally move to address this urgent issue. It is something the majority could have avoided entirely, a concern the President could have obviated if he were only willing to take yes for an answer. While this procedure will not satisfy everyone on both sides, it's a way forward. I'm confident that we can get the 60 votes in the Senate for a DACA bill. And now there is a real pathway to get a bill on the floor and through the Senate. It is a good solution, and I will vote for it. I'm incredibly grateful to the bipartisan group that has come together in recent days to renew the immigration debate with a sense of urgency. There you are. I believe that this group has the potential to return the Senate to the kind of place it should be on the issue of immigration, a place for bipartisanship, a place for action, a place for achievement. The bipartisan group, in a very fine way, filled the glaring absence of the President in these talks. I expect the Majority Leader to fulfill his commitment to the Senate, to me and to the bipartisan group, and abide by this agreement. If he does not, of course, and I expect he will have breached the trust of not only the Democratic senators, but members of his own party as well. Through these complicated and lengthy negotiations, Democrats have always sought to be reasonable, to act in good faith, and get something real done. Despite all of our entreaties, the President was obstinate. Despite bipartisan support for DACA, the Republican majority dithered. The Senate has muddled along for too long, content to delay action on our most pressing challenges until the very last moment. That ends today. The Republican majority now has 17 days to prevent the Dreamers from being deported. Mr. President, we have a way to address the fate of the Dreamers, starting right now, instead of waiting until March, with the minority and the moderate middle empowered to bring a bill to the floor instead of being held by the most strident anti-immigration voices in the Republican caucus. And we, on our side of the aisle, will continue to fight as strongly as we can for the Dreamers in the weeks ahead. I say to all Americans, urge your senators to vote yes on the bipartisan compromise when it comes forward. Write, tweet, email, phone, visit, do everything you can so we can finally pass this bill. In a few hours, the government will reopen. We have a lot to do. The issue of the Dreamers demands resolution. A budget must be written. Health care has to be addressed. Relief provided to disaster-stricken parts of our country. Pensions and opioids, veterans, child care, all have to be taken care of. The Trump shutdown will soon end, but the work must go on, and it will. Thank you, and I yield the floor. Go ahead, go.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I want to thank the Democratic leader for his comments and his indication that he intends to support the measure before us. I think if we've learned anything, during this process, it's that a strategy to shut down the government over the issue of illegal immigration is something the American people didn't understand and would not have understood in the future. So I'm glad we've gotten past that, and we have a chance now to get back to work. And therefore, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to concur with a further amendment in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 195, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 195 with a further amendment shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President, before we call the roll, I ask unanimous consent that the Democratic whip be allowed to address the chamber for 3 minutes with the gracious approval of the Majority Leader.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, let me thank you very much and thank the Majority Leader for this opportunity. And let me thank my friend, my colleague, and our leader on the Democratic side for his passionate personal commitment to this issue involving the Dreamers and DACA. He has been by my side, and I've been inspired by his leadership from the start. And let me thank my colleagues. So many of you cast a vote that was very hard and very difficult because you believed, as I did, that the issue of immigration, the issue of the Dreamers, is the civil rights issue of our time. You stuck your necks out and said, I'm willing to go on record even if it's going to be hard to explain back home, and I will never forget that. The question now is how we move forward. What I have seen here on the floor of the Senate in the last few days is something we have not seen for years. Constructive, bipartisan conversations and dialogue on the floor, not just about this issue, which is obviously front and center, but about the future of this institution and what the Senate will be from this point forward. That, to me, has been encouraging because it says to me that we do have an opportunity to work together. My special thanks to Senator Susan Collins, my friend, and Senator Lisa Murkowski for joining with Jeff Flake and joining with Lindsey Graham and joining with Cory Gardner and others who've been working on this issue for so long to try to make a positive impact on this debate so that we can move forward. I cannot tell my colleagues how many have come up to me from the other side of the aisle and said, we're with you on this issue. We want to help you get this done. Each of them has a little different take on what that means, but I do believe them. And I do believe we have this opportunity to move together. Now comes the test, the real test, as to whether we can get this done, whether we can be the Senate again, whether we can return to a regular order on the floor and constructively have a debate. For some of you, it'll be the first time you've ever seen it. But believe me, it's worth the price of admission, all it took for you to come to the United States Senate. So now we have to stand together. My last word is this. We have gathered the largest bipartisan group of senators to ever commit to moving forward on the DREAM Act and immigration. We have a process. I want to thank Senator McConnell for explicitly saying today it will be a level playing field. It will be open to both sides. We will move to the issue, as you characterized it this morning, of DACA and immigration. Thank you for doing that. I believe that that sets the stage for us to work together. For the first time in 5 years, we will have a debate on the floor of the Senate on the DREAM Act and immigration. To all the Dreamers who are watching today, don't give up. I know that your lives are hanging in the balance on what we do here on Capitol Hill and with the White House. 3 weeks from now, I hope to be joining you in celebrating the passage with you and your families and your communities of a measure which will strengthen America and give you an opportunity to be part of our future. Mr. President, I yield.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Collins.
Okay, folks, the vote is underway to end the shutdown. Democrats say enough Democrats are going to support this bill, so it will pass. So it looks like the shutdown is going to end today. Let's watch the vote as it happened. This will reopen the government until February 8th. So we'll watch and listen right now.
Children. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Cochran. Gotcha. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Thank you. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. I did, thanks. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Test room. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Gotcha. Mrs. Gillibrand. Gotcha. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, sir. Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Casey, Mr. Leahy, not yet, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Hassan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kane, Kennedy, King, Klobuchar, Lankford, Manchin, McCaskill, McConnell, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson, Perdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Burr. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blumenthal, Cortez Masto, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hirono, Leahy, Lee, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Paul, Sanders, Tester, and Warren. Mr. Wyden, no.
Hey, folks, so here's what is happening right now. This
Mr.
vote
Booker,
here is
no.
to overcome the filibuster and limit debate and bring the bill to a vote. So this vote is going to pass. It needed 60 votes to pass to break the filibuster. There are currently 78 yes votes and 17 no votes. So once this vote ends, then they will have to vote one more time to approve the spending bill. And once that's the last vote, they have to approve the spending bill. But this was the big one. This is the one they needed 60 votes for. The next one they just need 51 for. So this bill will pass. It funds the government through February 8th and also extends funding on the Children's Health Insurance Program for 6 more years. Once this bill passes the Senate, the House will need to pass it, and the President will need to sign it. And then once that happens, then the government will be reopened again. That should all happen, I would think, fairly rapidly today. And the government will reopen until February 8th. Until February 8th, there will need to pass, the Congress and the President will need to pass another spending bill before February 8th to avoid another shutdown on February 8th. But for now, the Senate looks like it's going to approve this short-term spending bill to keep the government open until February 8th. Again, this vote they're having right now is to limit debate and bring the bill to a vote. This was the big vote. This vote is going to pass. They already have enough votes. And once this vote is over, they should be having another vote to officially pass the bill, which they only need 51 votes for, and that will pass as well. So we're going to wait and just watch the proceedings here while this is happening. But for this to officially get out of the Senate, this vote has to officially end, and then they have to have another vote where they approve the spending bill. So I presume that will happen pretty quickly. And so we'll listen into it now, and then we'll be, after the voting happens, we'll come back on and talk about it with you guys. So stick around and keep watching.
Mr. Markey, no.
Okay, folks, so this is Steve Lookner with Right Side Broadcasting. We are watching the Senate live right now as they vote to reopen the government until February 8th. They have to do 2 votes to do this. This is the first one. This one's almost done. This is the one to end debate and overcome the filibuster and bring the bill to a vote, and then they'll have to have another vote to approve the bill. But this was the more difficult one. This needed 60 votes. The other one will need 51. And they already have 78 votes. This bill's going to pass. So...
Well, objection. The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I represent 88,000 federal workers in the 8th Congressional District of Maryland.
February 8th. The President and the House will have to pass yet. And now we'll have to see. So once, assuming that all happens and the government reopens today, they'll have to pass another spending bill by February 8th. And also, as part of this deal reached today, Mitch McConnell has said, let's see. Mitch McConnell has said that he will, sorry, we're having a little video issue on the screen. So, I'll keep talking here. We're going to get the Senate back up there. We went to the House for a second. So, as this, hold on, I'm just making sure we're still, here we are. So we're getting the Senate back on the air here, guys. So the House is going to vote on this bill after the Senate completes voting on the bill. And we'll hopefully get that back on the screen up shortly. But as part of this bill passed today that the Senate is passing to reopen the government, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have agreed in the Senate to have a debate on and a vote on some sort of DACA bill. They haven't promised to pass a DACA bill, but they have promised to have a debate on the bill and to have a vote on a DACA bill in the Senate. So that's going to happen either before February 8th or immediately after February 8th. Hang on, I just want to see what's going on here. You might hear something from the Senate in a second, just a little voice, but they're still having this vote. So anyways, if you want to write in while we're covering this, give me a shout. Write to me on Twitter, @Lookner, @LOOKNER, and I'm going to read some of your comments on the air. Okay, Jake, I got your message. So let me get to some of your comments here. Write to me on Twitter, @Lookner, as we wait. So I wonder if the president is going to do an appearance today. I could see, once the Senate has passed this bill and the House has passed the bill, I could see the president doing some sort of signing ceremony where he makes some sort of statement. I don't know if that's going to happen today, but we will bring that to you if it happens. 8 years of MAGA writes in, Democrat shutdown soon to be over, GOP didn't blink. Let's see here. A political DJ writes in, thanks for this Senate vote coverage today and all your RSBN broadcasts. Your efforts are appreciated. Thank you for saying that. Thump writes in, blink. Well, actually, in response to Schumer saying in a few hours the government will reopen. So Thump thinks that Schumer blinked. Gary Crunk says, our viewer Gary Crunk says, Democrats are using the budget as a gun to America's head to try and force amnesty and DACA down the throats of the American people. Illegal immigrants are still illegal. America is tired of the hypocrisy when it comes to Democrats and illegals. It is insanity.
Mr. Sullivan.
If you have comments, write to me on Twitter, @Lookner. Our viewer Chest Harrington writes, they all have to go back. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure, but seeing how the Democrats behave changed my mind. Really Rick says, those were some pretty unflattering, almost name-calling things Schumer said about President Trump during that speech. The president isn't going to like that. And Christopher Orpilla wrote to me with something which I had actually tweeted out earlier. Something I saw earlier was from Manu Raju of CNN. Manu Raju of CNN tweeted out, several progressive senators are not happy with this deal. They don't trust McConnell and think their party shouldn't have accepted his assurances. So we are watching the Senate vote to end the shutdown. Their vote isn't over yet, and it's only, right now it's 80 to 18, and there are two votes that need to take place. This is the first of the two, and this is 80 to 18, so it's going to pass. I don't know what the holdup is. I assume there are two votes remaining. One of them is probably McCain because he's not around. And maybe Mitch McConnell is the last one, and there might be some procedural reason. I assume there's some procedural reason the first vote hasn't ended yet. But they're going to have a second vote to pass this bill. Solomon's Temple says, lawmakers so lazy these days, they don't even filibuster. They just say they intend to filibuster, abuse of the intended use for rule. See, you're saying the intended use is that if people want to filibuster, they're really supposed to literally stand up there and talk nonstop. But they don't even do that now. They just threaten to do that. Equivalent of doing a filibuster. We're going to go back to the Senate in a second. So I'm going to stop talking for a second. Let's go back to the Senate floor. First.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 81, the nays are 18. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Cloture having been invoked, the motion to refer falls.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me tell you how pleased I am, the people of Maryland, that we are now in the process of ending this government shutdown. The government shutdown does not benefit anyone. It certainly doesn't benefit the federal workers who live in Maryland and the federal workers around the nation. The uncertainty that a shutdown brings, those that are exempted are asked to work without knowing when they would get a paycheck. Those that are on furlough don't know whether they'll ever get a paycheck or not. It's not in the interest of our federal workforce. It's certainly not in the interest of federal contractors who depend upon contracts that have been put on suspension. It's not in the interest of the public who depend upon governmental services, and it ends up costing taxpayers more money. So, Mr. President, I'm pleased to see that we're on path to end this shutdown, to get government back up and a path forward. I also am pleased that we've at least accelerated by 2 weeks the deadline for getting a budget done. Many of us have expressed major concern about continuing to operate under a continuing resolution. That makes no sense. We heard from the Department of Defense that they cannot keep our country safe on continuing resolutions. We know that agencies, when they're trying to plan their mission, cannot operate on continuing resolutions. for the public, continuing resolutions state that we're going to operate on last year's budget. It doesn't reflect this year's. It doesn't reflect this year's priorities. And that's what we should be doing every year. So in this case, the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. We would think that a budget could have been done by October 1, which is when the fiscal year began, October 1 of last year. We're now approaching 4 months under the FY18 budget, and we still don't have a budget. So one of the parts that I am pleased about as we move forward, we've had real, I think, positive discussions that by the February the 8th date, it's realistic to expect that we're going to be able to enact budget numbers so that the Appropriations Committee can recommend to the full chamber and we can pass appropriation bills or a cromnibus or an omnibus that will allow our agencies to have full year appropriations, or I should say the remainder of this year's appropriations. And I certainly hope that will include FY19. That would certainly be the best. And that it will be balanced between the needs of the Department of Defense and the non-defense agencies. We have critical functions that require to have a full year of appropriations for, including our national defense, Department of Defense, our State Department, the Department of Health, and the work that's done in National Institutes of Health, the Food Safety and the Federal Drug Administration, the ability of the Social Security Administration to deliver checks to our seniors and to take care of our health care needs. All that requires that we have the predictability of a budget. So I'm pleased that we were able, during this debate, I wasn't pleased we had a shutdown, but I'm pleased that during this debate, we had great discussions among Democrats and Republicans that we are committed to bringing out a budget by February the 8th so that we can give that type of predictability to the people of this country. That was one of the principal frustrations that many of us didn't want to go for another continuing resolution without knowing how we're going to deal with the budget. There are some special needs that we've had particular attention to that we really also need to get done by no later than February the 8th. One of that is the opioid funding. Opioid funding, clearly, it's in our national interest to recognize that we have a national crisis. Every community in the country is suffering from the opioid crisis, and we need to make sure that we give the wherewithal for the federal government to be a strong partner in dealing with this crisis. Many of my colleagues have talked about disaster relief. We certainly need to give help to the communities of Texas and Florida, the Puerto Rico, the wildfires of West. We know that we got to get that done now. We can't wait another month. Let us make sure that by no later than February the 8th, we've also dealt with that issue. I'm pleased in the legislation that we're considering now that we will deal with the Children's Health Insurance Program. I wish it was permanent. Rather than putting another deadline on the program, we should try to make this permanent. It's been bipartisan success program in all of our states, and the Children's Health Insurance Program needs further attention for permanency. However, the legislation that we're in the process of passing does not deal with community health centers. We know that most of our children, parents that are using the CHIP program are going to be using health centers. We need to extend the programs for our health centers. There are a lot of extenders out there, Mr. President, we need to act on. Just to mention one, the one that I've been interested in and have authored legislation deals with the therapy caps. Therapy caps mean that those who have the most serious needs for therapy services, those suffering from stroke, those type of injuries, are not able to get the full services, or at least threatened not able to get the full services because of a therapy cap. We've extended it ever since we put it into law. It should never have been put into law, the caps, but we also need to pay attention to it in this budget debate, and that also needs to be dealt with by February the 8th. My colleagues, we've brought up the serious pension issues that affect the workers in this country. That needs to be addressed. So there's reason to say that I'm pleased that the government's back up, or will be back up shortly, but we really need to negotiate and not operate under continuing resolutions. I think the amount of spotlight that's been put on these issues, we have a much better chance to get to these budget issues resolved through appropriations or a cromnibus or an omnibus rather than another continuing resolution. And then, Mr. President, there is the issue of the Dreamers that I have talked about numerous times on the floor of the United States Senate. The Dreamer issue is urgent. It's urgent. Many Dreamers' lives have already been affected and their lives have been changed as a result of President Trump's announcement last September, putting a 6-month time limit on when the Dreamers would be subject to deportation. That deadline occurs early March, but in the meantime, those that are up for renewal of status, there's been uncertainty as to whether they will be able to continue to reside here in America, that they'll be able to continue to have a driver's license or work. They feel like they have, and they do have, a date on the back of their body saying that they expire on a particular date. That anxiety needs to end. It should never have been started under President Trump's edict in September, but we need to respond to that in an urgent way. So I was very pleased that we have a commitment from the majority leader that by no later than February the 8th, if we have not passed the bipartisan DACA protection, Dreamer protection bill, that we will have that bill on the floor of the United States Senate in a manner in which the majority, that the Senate can speak. And I'm very confident that the compromise that have been negotiated with Senator Graham and Senator Durbin, we will be able to pass that bill that would protect the Dreamers. Yes, it does. What it does is it allows the Dreamer status to maintain and puts them in a pathway so they can have permanent citizenship here in the United States, and they know that their future is America. After all, it's the only country that most know. So that is certainly a very encouraging sign. I was also very pleased to hear in the negotiations that took place that legislation would also provide the protection for those that are here in temporary protective status. President Trump, in some of the cases, has extended dates and said this is the last extension that could expire within the next 18 months. In some cases, he's deferred making that decision for some countries. What we know about those in temporary protective status, they're very similar to the Dreamers, that many know no country but the United States as their home. And it's important that we protect their status here in the United States and provide them a pathway for permanency and citizenship here in the United States. They are part of America, and they are part of our economy. In the meantime, Mr. President, I would hope that there would be a consensus here and support from the White House that the enforcement procedures that are being used against the immigrant community is mindful of the efforts being made here to provide them a permanent status, and that the priorities on enforcement that we've heard mentioned many times, which quite frankly are very confusing to the immigrant community, that those priorities would not aim at those that are going to be protected under the legislation that we will be considering in the next few weeks. So, Mr. President, we all are pleased that we are now able to move forward to keep government open, that we have a commitment to deal with the budget of our country by February the 8th and the Dreamer issue by that date, that we've made real progress. As Senator Durbin observed, and I must tell you, I think each of us did also, that during this very difficult time, the conversations that we've had among our colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been very encouraging. I think the members of this body want to return to the great traditions of the United States Senate, where we listen to each other, where we work together, where we compromise, and we're able to come to successful completion of our work. Too much work virtually no work has been done, but too much is on the table right now that needs to get finished. And let us take advantage of these next few weeks to show the American people that indeed we will work together in the best interest of our country, putting partisan politics aside, dealing with our budget issues, dealing with our immigration issues, dealing with our health care issues, dealing with our pension issues. We can do the people's work. Let's get that done, and let's start right now in getting that work completed. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Hey everybody, it's Steve Lichtner with Right Side Broadcasting. So, where we are at right now is that the Senate, they have to have one more vote to actually approve the bill to reopen the government. But that bill, that it's going to be approved. They had to have 2 votes, and they've had 1, and they have to have a second one. So the big vote already happened. So they're going to vote to reopen the government. Now, this bill needs to go to the House once they pass it officially in the Senate, and then the House has to sign it, and then the President has to sign it. So all of this is going to happen today, but we're just waiting to see when all that happens. Now, also, there's supposed to be a White House press briefing at 1:30 Eastern Time, which is 20 minutes from now. I'm assuming that's going to still happen. I'm not sure about the timing, though, of this. So we are planning on bringing that to you as well. So at some point this broadcast will end, and then we'll go to the briefing broadcast. But I'm trying to find out when the White House, if they've adjusted the White House press briefing time, or if they're still going to have it at 1:30. And it's still scheduled for 1:30, so we'll keep an eye on that for you. And I just want to see, so we'll stay on for a few more minutes here. We're going to stay on with the Senate coverage, but eventually we're going to go, I'm going to leave this broadcast, and we're going to start our press briefing coverage. And so you can watch that as well at Right Side Broadcasting. Ooh, actually, so hang on one second here. So Jake has been producing today, doing a great job, Jake and Joe. Jake, I see that the White House is now live, so it looks like, Jake, the briefing is going to start fairly soon. I don't know, because they say 1:30, but maybe it'll be delayed, but they are live, so... Oh, I see. So we're already up on that, Jake. Fantastic. All right, so what you can do, guys, you can open both windows. It's a little confusing right now what's happening. Let's see. All right, so Jake, I think what we might want to do is maybe we'll do a couple more minutes here, and then we're going to go. Then I'm going to go and shift over to the briefing stream. That's what's going to happen. So we'll spend a couple more minutes on this stream, and then I'm going to switch to the briefing stream. You can open both streams if you want, but our stream of the briefing right now has nothing on it. Thanks to all of our moderators who've been moderating today: JC and Guinevere and Barbara Braley, Roger Vega, Webster, Real Frank, and Common Sense and Gleno on the website. Let me read some of your comments while I have a chance here. Elijah Johnson says, how many no votes would it take to stop DACA going into law? Well, for DACA, a DACA bill to pass the Senate will take 60 votes. So you would need 40 votes to stop. You'd need 41 votes to stop a DACA bill. Let's see. Barry N. Weaver writes, no DACA, and it's time for American dreamers, not illegals. All right, let me see here. Jake, why don't we, Jake, I think, Jake, I'm going to wrap, I think, Jake, we should wrap this up, and then I'll move over. Yeah, we're gonna wrap this up here. So, oops. So sorry what you're seeing right now. We're going to wrap this up right now, our Senate coverage, and then I'm going to switch over in a minute to the press briefing coverage. So for our continuing coverage of the events of the day, what you should do is open up a window at Right Side Broadcasting on YouTube with our coverage of the press briefing. The event is already on our YouTube page. You can go find it there. Just open that window. I will be there in a minute. But we're going to wrap up right now this stream, which was the Senate vote coverage, because all of the excitement is basically over there. So thank you for joining us for this stream. Please join us in a minute over at our other stream covering the press briefing. And don't forget, we are viewer supported, so if you've been enjoying our coverage, please consider donating. Your donations are what allow us to do this. You can donate by going to the bottom of the YouTube chat and clicking on the $ at the bottom of the YouTube chat, or going to rsbn.tv/donate, rsbn.tv/donate. Okay, I'm Steve Lookner, and you can follow me at Lookner on Twitter, @Lookner, and don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube and click the notifications bell when you subscribe. And follow us on Facebook, Right Side Broadcasting. Thank you to Jake Seals for producing this. Great job, Jake, and Joe Seals as well. Jake is at Jacob RSBN Music, and Joe is at Joe Seals, Joe Seales. So I'm going to get off here now, and I'm going to head over to our stream for the press briefing. Join us there. But for now, thanks for watching this coverage. Have a great day. Hope to see you for our press briefing coverage in a minute. Okay, thanks.